U iznimno povezanom svijetu društvene platforme poput Twittera, Facebooka i Whatsappa preobrazile su način na koji komuniciramo s društvom i dijelimo informacije. Danas više od 5 milijarda ljudi ima mobilni telefon. Više od polovine njih su pametni telefoni s kamerom i internetskom vezom. Milijuni poruka, fotografija i videa kruže svakog dana društvenim mrežama i teško je razabrati istinit sadržaj od lažnoga. Borba za kontrolu nad istinom tek počinje.
Information warfare is a weapon and a very dangerous weapon.
If I see a piece of content that I have an emotional response to, it takes less than a second for me to share.
The consequences are very, very dangerous of having a society in which lies and truth have equal meaning.
Kako nastaju lažne vijesti? Kako utječu na društvo i mijenjaju države? Tradicionalni mediji, društvene mreže i vlade imaju odgovornost stati na kraj tim dezinformacijama.
Journalists have a real responsibility now to be very careful, very transparent, to keep trust with their audiences.
Companies have a strong responsibility in terms of making sure that their platforms aren't being used to disseminate hate or propaganda.
The risk of governments regulating social media is that they will regulate something that we don't fully understand.
Društvene mreže su izazov, ali i nova prilika. Društvo dobiva moć. Društvene mreže omogućuju vam da u stvarnom vremenu objavite što se događa bilo gdje na svijetu i svaki vlasnik pametnog telefona ima priliku postati novinar.
Once social media appeared in our lives, we realized that social media enabled us to gather in the streets and make revolutions.
We saw how Twitter played a key role in Catalonia in communicating to the world what was happening during the elections and the police brutality that we saw.
Seria molt estrany i no passarà de que hi hagi qualsevol tipus d'intervenció policial.
Barcelona is a big city of Europe. We are a very plural society with a clear democratic vocation. We have a lot of visitors every year, so we are an open-minded society. And for the first time in many years, on October the 1st of 2017, the Catalan government asked the people to vote in a referendum just to decide if the citizens want to become independent from Spain or not. It was like yes or not. This confronted with the Popular Party of Spain that called that referendum was illegal. The courts gave the order to the Spanish police and the civil guard to avoid that referendum. They have to take off the ballot boxes and the papers. That court said that they have to avoid the referendum, but without violence. But it wasn't.
The 1st of October, I was here in London. I was intrigued to see what was going to happen, but I did not expect that it would be a big international news event until suddenly, at some point that morning, someone sends me a message by WhatsApp and says, turn on the TV and you'll be amazed at what is happening in Catalonia.
I went to Pau Claris. Pau Claris is like a big school in Barcelona. When I arrived there, there was about 200 people, more or less. Many of us did know each other, but we had organized through WhatsApp. And I remember that the people called We are people of peace. We are people of peace.
It would have been very, very difficult to organize the voting that took place that day without social media and without the instant means of mass communication between people that the internet provides.
Social networks are facilitating the logistics that are necessary to organize collective action, not only because they make the diffusion of information cheaper and easier, but also because they facilitate coordination when protests take place on the street.
They were sitting on the floor peacefully, trying to avoid confiscating the ballot boxes. Suddenly, the police arrived, and we could not believe what was happening. I just watched that there was no cameras or no official cameramen there, and I'll take my cell phone and I'll just start to record.
In countries where citizens lack fundamental democratic freedoms like Iran or China, social media play a fundamental role. These networks allow information that wouldn't circulate through more traditional means like mainstream media to flow and reach people that wouldn't have been exposed to that information in the absence of those networks.
Social media platforms are key institutions of democracy nowadays. So the opportunities that social media platforms have brought us are mainly the fact that they have given voice to those silenced people that they hadn't voiced before. And I'm not only talking about non-democratic regimes where people through social media they can spread information, but I'm also talking about in democratic systems how people can organize collective action on social media platforms.
When the police entered to the school, the violence was extreme. I'm sure that without that video, no one could believe that was happening in that school. So that's why I decided to record that video.
It's as if the Spanish government went into this day, or the government or the Spanish police, the civil guard, just unaware of the times in which we live. They've forgotten that every person with a mobile phone with a camera on it is a potential journalist, and that, we're not living in an age when there's just half a dozen TV cameras, all maybe in the same place, but everywhere where there was voting going on, there were people watching.
After that, I went out of the school and I just decided to spread that video, and I just send it to all my contacts, like groups on WhatsApp, friends, all the people who were here in that school. And it was amazing because after about 10 minutes, that same video came back to me in about 6 different sources. So friends, family, and different people just give that video back to me. It was like, whoa, that's spreading really fast.
Social networks were enabled citizens to communicate what was happening in real time, and half of the world, the whole world, was able to follow the events of October 1st in Catalonia almost as they were happening. And this was something that in Catalonia hadn't happened at this scale before.
I shared the video on Twitter, and after 10 minutes, Julian Assange and WikiLeaks retweet that video. So it was amazing. It was about 40,000, 50,000, 60,000 retweets in about 1 hour or 2 hours.
A Spanish government official has tweeted that police...
In fact, those same days, different media, like Al Jazeera, BBC or CNN, used it to explain what was happening in Catalonia.
319宣布獨立，中央可以行使憲法。
Hemos pasado mucho miedo.
I wouldn't say social media are the new weapon. The weapon really is the message and the target for social change. Social media are a weapon to the extent that they help those messages be visible and they help people self-organize and coordinate and generate a lot of action that will make some demands more visible in the public spotlight.
Na prestižnom Annenbergovu fakultetu za komunikaciju u Filadelfiji pokazuju kako su društvene mreže olakšale komunikaciju među građanima koji se njima služe kao megafonima. Profesorica Sandra Gonzalez otvara raspravu o društvenim prosvjedima koji su organizirani preko društvenih mreža.
So this video that I'm showing you on the screen, it's an example of content that is published in social media that goes viral very quickly. This footage, which was taken with a phone, was taken over by big media outlets and it was shown internationally. It reached a lot of people and it allowed the message that this referendum was trying to convey to go global. And it's just an example, another example of how social media allows user-generated content to go global. And so I would like you to give me other examples of other cases where you think social media have played a role in allowing people to send a message to the world successfully. Can you think of other examples?
Yeah. Well, that reminds me of a lot of things happen in China. Especially for some protests, because we're not allowed to have protests on the streets, but sometimes people just self-organize the protests via the social media.
I think, well, the first thing that comes to mind, just because I'm doing a little research with it, is the role of social media with the Syrian civil war. And how a lot of sort of citizen journalism is kind of happening it is the most social mediated civil conflict in history, if I've read that correctly. So it's often used to show imagery of the war that reporters can't get, but it's still subject to a lot of the issues that war imagery has, whether it's propaganda or whether it's really showing the truth of what's happening in those events. So it's interesting how social media allows people to sort of self-report on wars.
What we saw was that the people now had powerful tools at their disposal that were, for the first time, not controlled by the government, and that they could use these tools not only to organize themselves among the population, but then also to disseminate this news and images and video to the rest of the world.
The Arab Spring was really one of the most prominent examples of social media amplifying a message that would otherwise have remained very local and constrained. And it facilitated the scaling up the protest on an international scale and triggering this phenomenon of contagion, even though, again, contagion here is just a metaphor, but it inspired other movements in other political contexts to arise, partly because these movements emulated the use of digital technologies to amplify a political message.
Catalan referendum took place in 2017, and 100% of the people were connected to the internet with cell phones and access to broadband. WhatsApp penetration is huge in Catalonia, and everybody was well aware of how important technology and the technological infrastructures were for the referendum. whereas in the Arab Springs, penetration in some cases were of the 15%, in some countries as Libya were 5%, I recall, and not all the people were connected.
So these two examples, the Arab Spring and the Catalan referendum, are very different in many different ways. There are many sociological differences in the context from where these movements arise, but they obviously share in common a lot of things as well. And in particular, they have in common the use of digital networks and digital technologies to spread their message.
I wouldn't say that there is a direct relationship between social movements and disinformation. What happens is that once social media appear in our lives, it enables people to gather in the streets and make revolutions throughout the whole world, but it also empowered people to make disinformation that destructs democracy.
On the one hand, the internet has been used to hold very powerful interests accountable, to rally citizens to the public square in order to demand their rights, to film and disseminate clear abuses of power by governments. And on the other hand, it's been used by more malevolent actors in order to subvert the democratic process by manipulating online discussions, by smearing journalists, silencing prominent opposition voices on social media.
In the last 10 years, there have been these huge societal shifts. We've had the global financial crisis that we still haven't understood the real implications. We've seen climate change. We've seen a huge migration trends. We've seen people losing their jobs because of automation. People are feeling much more vulnerable than ever before. And so when people are feeling vulnerable, they become tribal. And when people become tribal, it's about them and us. And that's what misinformation takes advantage of.
I'm not going to give you a question. You are fake news. Go ahead.
I refuse to use the term F*** news. The term has become weaponized. It's been used by politicians around the world as a way of undermining a free press, which is critical to any democracy.
We never make reference to fake news and we talk about disinformation for several reasons. The first of all, it's because this disinformation that we are consuming has never meant to be news, and therefore we shouldn't call it that. The second reason is because we're not so sure what it means. So that leads to some confusion, and it's actually been a weaponized term somehow by politicians. And the third reason is because when we talk about news, we imagine a specific format. And when we talk about disinformation, we need to include images, videos, memes, audios to understand the whole problem.
Stručnjaci predviđaju da će se 2022. na internetu više čitati lažne vijesti nego istinite. Organizacije poput First Draft Newsa u Americi, na čijem je čelu Claire Bordel, uče novinare i građane detektirati dezinformacije i boriti se protiv njih.
So as humans, we have an emotional relationship to information. Academics and journalists, we like to pretend that people have a rational relationship to information, but that's not true. The types of information that we share on social media are the types of informations that make us happy or sad or cry or make us feel connected to others.
So visual content plays a crucial role in triggering this kind of chain reaction that we call contagion. It triggers a very visceral emotional response. Certain images, certain videos make it more likely that people will share news and information because their emotional response to that content is stronger. And there is a correlation between the emotional response to content and then your decision to participate in the chain reaction or join the campaign or simply to transmit that information.
Llavors, sobre les 9, sí, 9, 9 i 5, la gent estava asseguda, molta gent asseguda davant de l'escola, a terra, i llavors vaig sentir unes sirenes. Llavors sí, vaig veure que venien 2 furgons de policies, molts policies, i clar, allò em va impactar molt. Llavors em vaig posar a gravar-ho. I estan arribant els Mossos per no deixar-nos votar. No els Mossos, o no la policia. Els vaig anar seguint jo amb el meu mòbil per tot arreu. Quan ells van arribar quasi davant de l'escola, ja van començar a treure gent. I mentre estava gravant, de sobte em vaig trobar una senyora amb la cara plena de sang. La vaig estar gravant un moment, però vaig deixar de gravar per si la podia ajudar. No, sí, ha sugat una mica, ha sugat. De fet, és una fotografia que ha sortit per tot arreu, a les xarxes socials. Vaig començar a veure que la fotografia de la senyora tenia impacte quan vaig llegir que deien que era una foto falsa. Evidentment, jo m'he enfadat moltíssim, perquè jo sabia que no era ni falsa ni trucada.
If people are spreading information and that's scaling up, it is possible that they're spreading misinformation, and that's scaling up in ways that it wouldn't have done before. So we've always had misinformation. It's not something new. We are beginning to understand some things about misinformation which are worrying. I mean, if people are exposed to misinformation, then even after they're told, it's misinformation, they are more likely to carry on believing it than if they hadn't seen it.
U sklopu Oksfordskog sveučilišta, jedan je od najprestižnijih instituta za studij novinarstva, Reutersov institut. Silvija Mažo proučava ulogu društvenih mreža u društvenim pokretima i vrijednost provjerenih informacija iz tradicionalnih medija.
Social media platforms can be used to increase the antagonism in the public debate. Social media platforms can be used to spread disinformation, information that has the purpose to make harm, right? And social media platforms can also be used to highlight divisive issues in the public sphere.
Me ha pedido Julio un artículo en el que sale, es a partir de un vídeo de un coche, de un Ferrari dorado, en el que se dice que es del hijo de Maduro.
¿Y lo has hecho búsqueda inversa?
Sí, pero si es que no...
Sí, ha encontrado el origen del primer vídeo de la primera vez que se puso a hacer en circulación, que fue con el senador mexicano. We needed to build an independent non-profit platform after the Catalan elections in 2017 because we realized that this information had arrived in Spain as much as in the UK or in the US. We realized that we needed to dedicate much more efforts and we needed to be there for the citizenship to be able to distinguish between what is true and what is false.
Internet has decreased the cost of distribution of information and also has decreased the cost of production of information. So it's not anymore news media outlets that can produce information, but anybody else can do that. What this entails is that processes of verification, processes that legacy media outlets and also digital-born guarantee are not in play anymore for other sources, and any kind of information can be spread out.
Sve veći broj lažnih vijesti i glasina na internetu rezultirao je pojavom nevladinih organizacija u stalnom kontaktu s medijima i internetskim korisnicima koje provjeravaju točnost informacija u javnom prostoru.
We basically have established 3 reasons for which disinformation is created. The first one is basically because there's bad people in the world that actually want to make disinformation to see how far they can get, how many people they can fool with such disinformation. The second one is for economic reasons. People that makes disinformation so that you get into their web pages and see their advertisement and they get money for that. And there's a third reason, which I think it's the most dangerous reason, which is disinformation created for ideological reasons. This is someone is manipulating your take or your feelings about a specific issue so that you decide in one way and not in another that might be in favor of their ideology.
And those who are creating disinformation, who deliberately want us to share, they know what they're doing. They will share highly emotional content. Now, journalists can't share highly emotional content because they're journalists and they have to work with truth and facts. They have to be rational. And so journalism content is much less likely to be shared. So that's where we have that discrepancy.
For me, social media is a listening device. It enables me to stay tuned in to all sorts of conversations that non-journalists are talking about. So social media is a listening tool to be in touch with what audiences are engaged on, what stories they care about, and it's a reporting tool in order to find sources and verify sources and communicate with sources.
I would say that journalists have a big responsibility in helping to combat disinformation processes, information that has the purpose to do harm and it's false, right? And they are doing so. I mean, we have seen big initiatives in Brazil for the elections, also in Mexico, Comproba, Verificado, and also in France during the elections. In Nigeria and in India, they are also collaborating to combat fake news.
The basic responsibility traditional media have in the disinformation landscape is the fact that they don't have a good business model. And they're currently not putting enough resources or enough time in fact-checking the information that they publish. They have to publish a lot and sometimes not of good quality. And that makes them sometimes publish disinformation.
20 years ago, journalists didn't have to worry about false information. Journalism was all about the truth. So if they heard a rumor or a lie, they dismissed it. The problem now is that audiences want help in navigating the information that they're seeing on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and the social web. And so now journalists have to actually help audiences. But there are real challenges about how you report on disinformation. If you repeat the rumor in the headline, there's a possibility that you're actually encouraging more people to believe that fact.
The Times has a set of standards and processes and verification methods that are largely institutional. There's a standards guide here, and every reporter has to adhere to these standards, and they exist for very good reason. And they're often reevaluated as the industry and as technology changes. These enable us to sort of stay committed to things like verification and fact-checking, and they're built to prevent us from being susceptible to things that we think endanger a free press in other countries, such as bribes, such as gifts, and such as being compromised by people with a political agenda or a monetary agenda.
Now anybody can be a publisher. And so that in that environment, information can spread between trusted peers. So it's no longer because the New York Times says it, it's because my best friend tells me that it's true. And that's why this type of content can move at speed and is most damaging.
Technology has afforded us the freedom to communicate with people in video and audio and text who would be inaccessible decades ago or even 5-6 years ago. So we're now able to look at an attack in Yemen and get user-generated content or eyewitness video. And with a lot of technological listening tools, we can verify the geolocation of that video. We can even strip it down off the internet and figure out what kind of phone or camera was used to record it. And there are all sorts of tools out there that help us verify this information in the same way that we used to verify information in the old school way with public documents when we just used parchment paper.
John Carlin, pisac, scenarist i novinar, surađuje s medijskim kućama poput Financial Timesa, New York Timesa, BBC-a i Wall Street Journala. Živi u Londonu i Barceloni, odakle analizira globalni politički sustav.
I think we need professional journalists, possibly more urgently than ever before, to make some sense out of the babel of voices and the shrieking and shouting that we hear, and to try and distinguish what is true from what is false.
The media is a huge megaphone. So in terms of educating audiences, there's real responsibility on journalists. But the other responsibility is there's no room for mistakes anymore. And when the mainstream media makes a mistake, it allows politicians to say, look, I told you, it's fake news. We've had politicians from Donald Trump to Duterte in the Philippines, Bolsonaro in Brazil, using it as a way of simply saying, don't trust the media, trust me.
A fake news outlet.
Uma das fake news que se voltaram contra mim partiram da Folha de São Paulo.
And then, of course, there's fake news, which has been hijacked for political purposes by so many people, including President Trump.
It's a fake question. You're CNN, you're fake news.
He's making policy and then tweeting it. And we've never had that before. We've never had a president unpredictable and so unwilling to be constrained by institutional kind of rules and norms. And he's more visible because of social media. And he can get instant visibility and it's uncontrolled. He's uninstitutionalized, completely uninstitutionalized. And I agree that's a problem, but I don't think it's what he's saying to his 55 million followers.
And it's the end date.
Propaganda has always been a prominent tool for governments and other political actors to interfere with the political process.
Freedom House, nevladina organizacija za promicanje političkih sloboda i ljudskih prava, svake godine objavljuje izvješće Sloboda na netu, u kojem analizira vezu između vladinih institucija i interneta.
We've seen that the number of countries that display some type of disinformation and fake news and propaganda has only risen every year that we have covered this. So now we are at a situation where in 32 countries, these pro-government commentators are paid by the states in order to go online and manipulate conversations away from sensitive issues and towards the government's narrative around everything is going okay in the country and making sure that people are not criticizing public officials online.
Also, internet has facilitated a more close relationship between political candidates and citizens. Political candidates can talk to citizens through channels that are very, very close to them. I'm talking here about messaging apps, how messaging apps, which enable a very intimate conversation between individuals, are used by political candidates, and how this can make citizens to receive that information with less critical barriers that they might have when they receive information watching television.
Usually when we talk about this information, we refer to platforms such as Twitter or Facebook, but we need to take into account that the problem is much bigger. For example, there are some countries where consumption of news through WhatsApp is huge. We're talking about Spain, but also Brazil or Argentina or Nigeria or India. And in those places, WhatsApp and disinformation in WhatsApp is a huge problem we're not addressing yet.
तो ये कुछ कदम WhatsApp उठाने की तैयारी कर रहा है और अब आपको हम नक्शे के जरिए दिखा रहे हैं कि अब तक
And my worry is that we're in a space now where it's easier than ever before to create false content, and it's going to be circulating at speed in these trusted peer-to-peer networks, friendship groups, family groups, co-worker groups. And in those spaces, people are much more trusting, and this information is flying through those networks. And I don't think we'll have a way to slow those rumors down.
The thing about WhatsApp is that it's a private conversation. It's good that we cannot read what people are talking about in there, but it's also a threat because if they don't have anyone telling them that what they're reading in WhatsApp that their cousin sent them isn't true, that can generate problems. It has already. There have been episodes of violence in some countries because of false rumors spread through WhatsApp.
Meet Kavya. She lives away from her family.
First time.
WhatsApp messaging platform has published advertisements in key Indian newspapers to tackle the spread of misinformation. Its third such effort to combat a flurry of fake messages in the wake of the upcoming Indian elections.
Fake news on the family. And then, it was time for Dadaji's birthday. Be like Kavya. Share joy, not rumors.
Social media is definitely widening divisions between people. It's contributing to this global dialogue of the deaf, the polarization that you see inside countries and between different countries. Because what social media does, it gives more weight and more value to the people who shout loudest and who utter the more extreme views.
The most effective misinformation is that which divides. So there's a reason that populist candidates are emerging in places like Brazil and the US, and we're going to see other places around the world, because our countries are being divided. And so the role of mis and disinformation in dividing countries is what we need to take seriously.
I think information warfare is a weapon, and a very dangerous weapon. We tend to think of weapons in the traditional sense of tanks and military. And when we get attacked digitally, we tend to either shrug our shoulders or have a sort of a naive reaction in thinking that this isn't a big deal.
We should be teaching people, if you see something on social media and it makes you angry, then be more critical. So I think one of the most useful things people can think whenever they see a piece of content is, why is this being shared and who created it? When it comes to content sourced on the social web, the most important check is provenance. Who was the first person that created this piece of content? Because then you have some idea of motivation.
The question is, can technology help solve the fake news issues? I'm sure it can. How or what is the best? That's something for the industry to decide and figure out. And what is the more effective way to help solve this problem. Facebook can do that, Google can do that, and we had solutions for similar problems like spam and email, and there's still spam, but it's much less of a problem than it was before.
Companies have a strong responsibility in terms of making sure that their platforms aren't being used to disseminate hate or propaganda. One of the ways around this is, I think when there is information that is posted on places like Facebook or Twitter or YouTube that contributes to radicalization towards extremist views or the dissemination of fake news, that content is removed because it violates the terms of service of these platforms.
I think that some platforms like Facebook and Google have more power than some states and some governments. If they decide to campaign for a candidate or to overthrow a government, I think they have all the information they need because we gave them all this information throughout all these years.
Facebook and all these big companies have more information and more fresh information and more relevant information that any government has. And this is probably one of in the long term, these companies know about their citizens, about the infrastructure of their governments, about the infrastructure of cities and life of people, that allow them to understand better than anyone what are the needs of cities, governments, people.
And that goes for fake news, for foreign interference in elections and hate speech, as well as developers and data privacy. We didn't take a broad enough view of our responsibility, and that was a big mistake. And it was my mistake, and I'm sorry. I started Facebook, I run it, and I'm responsible for what happens here.
So part of the challenge here is that these platforms are global. They're in every country in the world. But from a regulatory point of view, we don't have a global government. And so you're seeing different governments step up to say, well, what can we do about this?
So I think governments need to think with a lot more rigor about regulating social media companies so it's not just a free-for-all. Because if we've learned anything in the past few years, it's that social media companies are not incentivized to implement real reform on their own. They're going to need the government to rope them in because their financial incentives benefit tremendously from a good disinformation story. So I think we as a society are going to solve this problem through many different sectors of society. But I think it begins with the government.
Décidé que nous allions faire évoluer notre dispositif juridique
pour protéger la vie démocratique de ces fausses nouvelles. Comme vous le savez, propager puissamment une fausse nouvelle sur les réseaux sociaux ne requiert aujourd'hui que quelques dizaines de milliers d'euros et peut se faire dans l'anonymat complet.
From a government perspective, I think that the main thing is to resist the temptation to pass new laws that make the government the arbiter between what is true and false online. Unfortunately, we've seen a lot of governments go the opposite way. And when governments are the ones that are determining what can and can't be said online, that presents an opportunity for abuse and also for making sure that the ruling party stays in power and can criminalize what the opposition is saying.
Part of the reason that politicians shouldn't really be part of the solution is because politicians are not neutral. And often politicians are also part of the information pollution problem. We have politicians who are lying and sharing misleading content. And politicians, it's not in their interest to have critics. It's not in their interest for people to have free and open discussions. In many parts of the world that do not have a First Amendment, it's very easy to clamp down on speech.
Is actually kind of the real problem here, not the social media. Yes, it's true that anything now in politics, good and bad, is going to be spread on social media. What we can do is try and restrict the kind of the pathologies, the hate speech, the misinformation that are part of the success of people like Trump or the new Brazilian president.
I think it was about 2 days after that video that the foreign minister of Spain, Alfonso Dastis, appears in several media, and he was just talking about everything was fake news. There was no real injuries.
I think by now, many of those pictures have been proven to be fake pictures.
Really? I couldn't believe that the former Prime Minister of Spain was telling the world that it was fake news. I just couldn't believe.
In January 2018, the European Commission made a public call so that different experts on disinformation would present themselves for a high-level group on disinformation and fake news.
But the high-level group has succeeded in formulating concrete steps to provide European citizens with trustworthy information and to make them better equipped to navigate in the online environment.
When the EU Commission set up this expert group, the idea was to bring many people from many parts of Europe, from many different disciplines, to kind of have a really honest conversation about what could potentially move the needle on misinformation. So we had people from the platforms, we had broadcast journalists, print journalists, academics, fact-checkers.
C'est pourquoi nous devons, avec la participation de tous, élaborer des mécanismes permettant d'identifier les fausses informations et de limiter leur circulation.
We ended up doing a report that has, I think, two very important things that we need to take into account. The first one is it said that we're not prepared to make a legislation against disinformation because we don't know the phenomena enough. We need to study it much more. And there's a very thin line between censorship and a law. And we need to be sure when we make it that we're on the law side and not on the censorship side. The second important thing that that report said is that we need to invest much more on education and on media literacy.
How and where should that regulation take place in a context of international information sharing across social networks where regulation is inherently domestic and based in particular countries? So I think there's a range of battles that we are dealing with, whether it's between those social networks and users and the government trying to censor, or whether we're talking about the right to privacy and the way in which social networks use and share our information in ways that we may or may not agree with, and bigger questions about then how do we regulate that in an international global setting. So social networks, I think, raise numerous problems and concerns around censorship, privacy, control, access.
For now 8 consecutive years, Freedom House has found that there's been a decline in global internet freedom. Essentially what that means is that governments are finding new ways in order to control the internet, to remain in power, to smear domestic opponents, and also to monitor what their citizens are saying and doing online.
Julian Assange and what has happened to him since 2010 is absolutely an example of the repressive measures.
These tools that people have often relied on are no longer available to civil society activists and to journalists because they're either being censored and blocked, or that the penalties for using these tools has become so great that many of the most prominent voices for democratic change in these more authoritarian countries are now behind bars.
After Julian tweeted a lot about the issues in Catalonia, he was tweeting about his support for the right to self-determination. He was tweeting about concerns about police brutality and violence here during the context of the elections, and his views about the way in which Spain had been dealing with the issue. After that, he was cut off from the internet by the Ecuadorian government. Not just cut off from the internet, he's been cut off from internet, cut off from visitors, cut off from having a telephone. He has been in this situation effectively in solitary confinement.
The country that receives the worst ranking in our Freedom on the Net report is China, followed by Iran, Syria, Cuba, and Ethiopia.
Most of the social media that these days people are using around the world is blocked in Iran, including Twitter, Facebook, YouTube.
Kad je Hasan Rohani izabran za predsjednika Irana, obećavao je unaprijediti ljudska prava u zemlji, uključujući slobodu izražavanja na društvenim mrežama. Amir Rashidi iz Centra za ljudska prava u Iranu tvrdi da se danas ta prava još više krše, a sloboda govora i sloboda medija više gotovo i ne postoje.
We don't have exact number how many people got arrested, but I think it's fair to say dozens of people get arrested because of speaking of their mind on Twitter, Facebook. Some of them are not don't get arrested. You know, they summon them and they using intimidation and technique like that in order to keep them silent and keep them away from the social media. Even some judge. They issue sentences which is like, you don't have rights to have access to the internet for like 2 years, which there is no way you can, apply this kind of charge and check if this guy is active on internet or not. But I mean, they use this method and technique in order to intimidate people to keep them silent.
During certain crucial moments like around elections or protests, many governments around the world will actually cut off access to the internet in order to make sure that information cannot be disseminated, oftentimes information that they don't agree with or that could lead to them losing power.
Governments try to control the access to the internet, and so it's definitely possible for governments to try and do that, and they will always try to do that and will be able to do that in some sort. But at the same time, there's decentralized technologies and technologies that are being built and developed in order to do the opposite, to facilitate the privacy and the flow of information online.
You could say that there is a battle between governments and social networks, particularly in the context of protest movements, where you see Twitter being used as a means of communication between protesters, both to publicize the fact of a protest and to organize a protest.
Društvene mreže preobrazile su komunikaciju, širenje informacija i olakšale organiziranje prosvjeda. One su izazov za vlade, platforme i za samo društvo koje će morati pronaći rješenje za budućnost društvenih mreža i informacija.
So there is evidence in the last 10 years where we've taught more young people how to be good consumers of information, that in fact they don't trust anything. They don't trust Wikipedia, they don't trust the BBC, they don't trust the New York Times, and instead they just trust those people who are closest to them. And that's a real concern. How can we give people skills and tell them to be skeptical, but not too skeptical? And that's a real challenge.
There's no way we can go back. There's no way we can just disconnect and get off the grid. And so we will have to renegotiate how we interact with these platforms. We will have to demand from these platforms that they define their role in democracies in a different way, and we will have to work with regulators and policymakers to ensure that our rights are protected.
I don't think it's out of control. Well, at least it's too early to say. Maybe it will get out of control. Maybe these platforms will become so poisoned that they can't be used anymore. I see absolutely no sign of that, but maybe that will happen.
The future of social networks is to disappear. I mean, it's an unwritten law of technology. And this doesn't mean that we won't have means of mass communication or personal communications probably much more efficient than the social networks right now.
They are definitely encroaching on the terrain of traditional media. And, you know, the whole point of, be it television, be it radio, be it newspapers, be it a man who's just standing in a corner giving a speech, is to have a political influence on people, which means to persuade people to win their hearts, to win their minds. And social networks have the power to do that and to reach huge numbers of people instantly. And so the political impact, which means emotional impact, which means persuasive impact, is enormous.
I think what we need to worry about, that misinformation, fake news, people dismiss it as being frivolous. It's not. I think it's the biggest crisis that we face as humankind because it's dividing us. And as we're divided, we're going to get to a point where democracy is no longer functioning and we've turned against one another. And that, I think, is the worry that we're not taking seriously enough now.
Telephone, it's really powerful. It's like a very important weapon. It's just a phone, but you can show what's happening everywhere in the world. You can spread it as Twitter or WhatsApp. It's the people who is powerful. It's not the media, it's the people.